Welcome students to Chapter 5, the skeletal system. Here's what we'll be going over in the skeletal system. Again, I can't stress enough to do those dynamic study modules and work through iLab and mastering as well to get to know this material. The skeleton, as you are probably aware, is a framework of bones and cartilage that performs several functions. And these are the functions listed, and I'll let you guys read for those. A big one is that it protects internal organs such as your brain, your lungs. And also certain bones produce blood cells in the red marrow, but I'll let you guys read through those functions of the skeletal system. The human body has 206 bones that vary in size and shape, and most bones consist of both compact and spongy bone, and we'll talk about what that means. Babies and young children have more bones in their skeleton because their bones have not all fused together yet. Compact bone is the dense outer layer of the skeletal system with few internal spaces, and this forms most of the shaft of long bones, and such as your arms and legs. And it's covered by what we call a periosteum, which is a layer that nourishes the bones. It consists of blood vessels, nerves, and cells involved in bone growth and repair. During puberty, or if you break a bone, you have new bone cells that will grow so the bone can become completely healed. An injury to this periosteum, such as a bruise or a fracture, would generate pain. The spongy bone is a more lattice-like network of bone. It's found in smaller flat-shaped bones, such as in your skull and in the face and in the ends of the shafts of your long bones. And in adults, this is where the spaces of some spongy bones are filled with red marrow, where your red blood cells will form. And the cavity in the shaft of the long bones is filled with yellow marrow, which is a fatty tissue for energy storage. So here's a look at what compact bone is. You can see there's few spaces in between compact bone and spongy bone. It forms more of a lattice-like network. It looks like a sponge, so you'll see spaces in between. Within the compact bone, we have these units called osteons, and an osteon is a central kind of canal-shaped structure that runs parallel to other osteons in compact bone. Here's a look at a bone cell that extends outward through tiny little canals to exchange and communicate with other bone cells. And this is a look at what spongy bone looks like from an electron microscope. You can see that bone is vascular. That means there's blood vessels running through it. So bone is very much an alive tissue with blood vessels, veins, arteries, and nerves running through it. So that osteon is the structural unit of compact bone. It consists of osteocytes, which are the mature bone cells that are arranged in rings around a central canal. Each osteocyte lies within what we call a lacuna, which is a small space, and tiny canals connect nearby lacuna and the central canal so they can communicate. So nutrients, oxygen, and waste can pass from cell to cell. Bone is living. It is hard due to its calcium and phosphorus salts, and that's the non-living component of it. And it's resilient due to strands of the elastic protein collagen. During embryonic development, most of your skeleton starts off first as cartilage. And unlike mature bone cells, which are enclosed in solid matrix, cartilage cells are capable of dividing. And the cartilage model will grow very rapidly as your fetus or the developing child will, especially beginning in the 3rd month and through prenatal development, the cartilage is being gradually replaced by bone. And here's a look at a fetus, a little baby, probably in the 3rd trimester. You can see that the bones are being clearly seen and they've been replaced by cartilage. You can also see the bones of the skull and how there's spaces in between the bones of the skull. Those spaces allow for the head to squeeze through the birth canal so the baby can fit when it's being born. So how does bone get transformed from cartilage to bone? This is a living tissue process. It begins with osteoblasts that form a collar of bone around the shaft of the cartilage model. Now, osteoblasts are a type of cell that build bone. Then they migrate to the bone cavity to form spongy bone. Cartilage cells within the growth plate divide, and as bone replaces the newly formed cartilage, in the region closer to the shaft, the bone will lengthen. The bone also increases in diameter as it lengthens. There's two regions of cartilage that remain at the end of the long bone. The cap that covers the surfaces that rub against other bones, and the growth plate, which is called the epiphyseal plate, and that's where this growth occurs from cartilage to bone. Here's a great video looking at how cartilage starts bone growth. And this takes you through the steps starting at cartilage and ending in childhood, where the cartilage will be replaced from bone. And you can see here the epiphyseal growth plate. That's where the bone will increase in length. Growth hormone stimulates bone growth during childhood. Thyroid hormones also ensure that the skeleton grows with proper proportions, and sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen prompt and stop the growth spurt of puberty. By the end of your teenage years, your sex hormones initiate changes resulting in less frequent cell division. So the growth plate will start to thin, you just won't grow as much. The ends of the bones will fuse with the shaft, and the bone can no longer increase in length. And we know that at the end of puberty, at the end of our teenage years, we're pretty much as tall as we're going to get. The role of fibroblasts and osteoblasts in repairing bone fractures, and that just has to do with whenever a bone will crack or break, usually due to injury. A non-displaced fracture is where the ends remain aligned, and a displaced fracture means the ends of these bones must be realigned. When a bone breaks, bleeding occurs because bones have blood vessels running through them, and a clot will form. And a clot is just a pooling of blood to try to stop the bleeding. Fibroblasts will invade the clot to secrete collagen fibers that form some sort of hard callus, linking the two parts of the broken bone back together. And then osteoblasts, which will eventually build more bone, transform the cartilage back into bone. And here's a great video about the role of those two cells in repairing bone fractures. Bones are continuously undergoing remodeling, especially if you've had braces before and you've had new bone being deposited by osteoblasts, which build bone, and old bone is broken down by osteoclasts. So as a way to remember which is which, I usually tell students osteoblasts build bone and osteoclasts kill bone or break it down. Bone remodeling repairs tiny cracks and regulates blood calcium levels. There's two hormones that are involved in bone growth and repair, and they're antagonistic, meaning they have opposite effects from each other. Calcitonin, released from your thyroid gland, decreases blood calcium levels. So calcitonin would tone down the blood levels of calcium. So it would take calcium out of the blood and store it in bone. And parathyroid hormone, released from your parathyroid glands, increase blood calcium levels. So parathyroid hormones would actually take the calcium from bone and put it back into the blood. And this will be important because you need calcium for several physiological processes in your body. In women, estrogen also plays a role in bone remodeling. It helps enhance the absorption of calcium from your digestive system. So some women who are going through menopause, who have less estrogen, take calcium tablets or calcium supplements, because without calcium, it's hard for them to get the calcium they need. It also, estrogen stimulates the formation of bone and initiates the breakdown of bone. Osteoporosis results when bone is broken down faster than it is deposited or built back up. Bone tissue forms in response to stress on the bone, and it's also absorbed in the absence of stress on the bone. So stress on the bone could mean weight-bearing exercises, lifting weights, exercising, walking, running. So it's important to get exercise in order to continue to build the strength of your bones. So then we'll get to some bones in the human body. We divide them into the axial and appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton are all of the bones of the skull, the rib cage, the vertebral column, which is your backbone, and the appendicular skeleton will be all the bones of your appendages, so all of your arms and your legs. The axial skeleton protects and supports our internal organs. It's composed of your skull, your vertebral column, and your sternum and your rib cage. The skull is the most complex bony structure in the body, and if you ever make it all the way through anatomy, you'll really learn to appreciate all the bones of the skull when you memorize them. There's two divisions, the cranial and facial bones of the skull. The cranial bones make up the parts of the skull that surround the brain, and the facial bones make up the bones that will be in the anterior side of the skull that make up your facial structures and facial features. Cranial bones protect the brain, house the structures of hearing, and provide attachment sites for the muscles of the head and neck. And you have 14 facial bones that support several sensory structures and serve as attachment site for most facial muscles. Before and shortly after birth, the bones of your cranium are connected by membranous areas called fontanelles, and these are the soft spots within a baby's head. And this allows the skull to be compressed and squeezed through that birth canal as a baby is born. It also allows for rapid growth of the brain during the fetal period in infancy. A baby's brain grows so quickly that the skull bones wouldn't be able to keep up with that growth. So the skull bones instead leave room for the brain to grow until it stops growing, and then the skull bones will fuse, usually by 1 or 2 years of age. And this is a look at an infant skull, and you can see the spaces between the skull bones, which are called fontanelles or soft spots. The vertebral column consists of 26 vertebrae, this neck vertebrae, the chest vertebrae, and the lower back vertebrae. And then it ends with a sacrum and a coccyx or tailbone. Intervertebral discs separate vertebrae from one another. They are made of pads of fibrocartilage, so these are the discs between vertebrae. They become compressed over the years, and individuals and they can also become shorter as they age because these vertebral discs will shorten. So that's why some people get shorter as they grow older. So here are your vertebrae, the 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. You also have 5 fused and 4, 5 fused sacrum and 4 fused coccyx, but we just call them one because they're completely fused together. Scoliosis is the twisting of the spine. It's abnormal curvature. The cause is unknown. It affects many young adults, primarily females, and treatment may involve a brace or surgery. You might remember getting tested for scoliosis in school by the school nurse leaning over, and she feels your spine. The term slipped disc is a misnomer. It's the word for a disc between your vertebrae that bulges but does not move out of place. And if a disc bulges inward, it can press against your spinal cord. It can interfere with perception of incoming stimuli, muscle control. If a disc bulges outward, it can press against your sciatic nerve and cause an extremely painful inflammatory condition called sciatica. 12 pairs of ribs attached to the back of the rib cage to the thoracic vertebra. The upper 10 are attached directly to the sternum, which is your breastbone, and the last 2 pairs do not attach to the sternum and are called floating ribs. So here's a look at your 12 pairs of ribs, how they're attached to the thoracic vertebra in the back. 10 are attached to the sternum in the front, and the bottom 2 are what we call floating ribs. The appendicular skeleton allows movement and interaction. These are the components. The pectoral girdle is what makes up the upper limb, the pelvic girdle is the lower limb, and then all your limbs. The pectoral girdle is composed of the scapula and clavicles, and the function of that is to support the arms and to connect the arms to the appendicular skeleton. And here's a look at the pectoral girdle made of your clavicle and scapula, and then the upper limb bones. The pelvic girdle is more rigid than the pectoral girdle. It's composed of 2 pelvic bones joined in the front, and it supports the legs. So here's your pelvis made of your pelvic bones connected in between with the pubic symphysis. Joints are places where bones meet, and they're classified as fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. Fibrous joints are held together by fibrous connective tissue. They have no joint cavity. Most do not permit any sort of movement. And a great example of a fibrous joint are the immovable joints between the skull bones in an adult. Cartilaginous joints also involve very little movement, and they're found between vertebrae, and they're also where your ribs attach to your sternum and in the pubic symphysis. Your synovial joints are extremely movable, and most joints in the body are this type, where the surfaces that move past one another have a thin layer of cartilage. There's a capsule containing fluid that surrounds these joints, and it's enforced with ligaments. So an example of synovial joints would be your knee. You can see the parts of the synovial joint listed here. This is where you have your PCL and your ACL. So some of you might have heard of someone who has torn their PCL or ACL, and you can see where they're located here in the knee. More type of joints, synovial joints can differ in the type and range of motion they permit. They can be hinge joints like the knee, ball and socket joints like the shoulder. And here are words that you should be familiar with: flexion and extension, adduction and abduction, rotation, circumduction, and supination and pronation. I'll let you guys review what those mean on your own time. But these are all movements of joints. A sprain is an injury to a ligament, and bursitis is an inflammation of bursa, which are fluid-filled sacs that surround and cushion joints. Arthritis is joint inflammation, and you can have osteoarthritis, which is degeneration of a joint over time, and rheumatoid arthritis, which is actually an autoimmune condition. The damaged joint can be replaced by an artificial joint. Since it's autoimmune, that means there's nothing that can really be done about it. Your body is kind of attacking itself. So from this chapter, you should be able to do the things listed here. And I hope you guys are doing well. Thanks for listening.